Ohio? Yeah.
Sons of Allah were guiding the new car with the ark of God on it, and Ohio was walking in front of it. David and Israel, all of Israel, were celebrating with all their might before the Lord with castanets, harps, lyres, timbrels, sistrums, and cymbals.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, lots of names, sorry. So like I said before, the ark is not in Jerusalem or with the tabernacle. It was moved, so if anybody remembers, I got a note here that the ark was placed in the tabernacle at Shiloh when Joshua was alive, and then the ark was captured by the Philistines for about 7 months. Then it was sent back to Israel, and it stayed at Abinadab's house in Kiriath Jearim, or Balal Judah, which is the same place, same name. It's translated the same way. So it is there. David decides to bring it back. So how do they move the ark? On a cart. It's a brand new cart, right? Which implies that there's some forethought to this, right? It's like, well, we want to make a cart especially for this. So they make a cart to transport the ark, and they're dancing and singing in front of it, right? And Uzzah and Ahio are the ones who are sitting in the front of the cart while it's driving. So there's a couple problems with this to begin with. The ark is not supposed to be moved on a cart. Does anybody know that? Anybody know how it should be moved? It's supposed to be carried. It was made with that purpose in mind. So there are 2 poles that go through it, and there are 4 men of a specific house who are supposed to carry the ark if it's to be carried, right? So we already have some problems here. Can I get somebody to read 6 through 10 for me? Yep, okay.
And when they came to Nachon's threshing floor, Uzzah put his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. Then the anger of the Lord was aroused against Uzzah, and God struck him there for his hand. He died there by the ark of God. And David became angry because of the Lord's outbreak against Uzzah. He called the name of the place Perez Uzzah to this day. David was afraid of the Lord that day. He said, "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" So David would not move the ark of the Lord with him into the city of David. But David took it aside into the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months. And the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household.
Okay, thank you. So, kind of a weird section, right? So what happens to Uzzah? He gets killed. He gets killed. Why does he get killed? Because he touched the ark. But he was just trying to stabilize it, right? It fell off the cart, right? It's kind of a weird story. So, I don't know. What do you guys think about that? Anybody got any thoughts? Is that concerning to anybody? Kind of strange?
Well, I think when God gives a command, how he wants things done,
Mm-hmm.
we are supposed to listen and obey.
Right.
And they started right off by not doing what God had said.
Yeah.
So anything else that followed, I know he was trying to stop the ark from falling, but he still touched it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So God is serious. He's serious in these commands. That's what I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
What I think.
Yeah, you're right, and it is important to note that they started off doing the wrong thing, right? Like this wasn't the only problem going on. There were a multitude of things that were happening that was not pleasant, right, or not pleasing to God. And Uzzah reaching out and touching it was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back, right? Like I told you not to touch it, I told you not to put it in a cart, I told you not to do these things, and you did all of them. So yeah, now the wrath of the Lord has been risen up. Right, and that's the question. Would it have been better to let it hit the ground?
Maybe he was trying to prove a point that he knew he was going to do it. Let it fall, let him touch it, and this is what you get from not doing what he said.
Yeah. Yeah.
The question I would have is, as we think about things, what can be the result of reacting versus responding to something? Because
Mm.
Maybe there was a time appropriately, I don't know.
Yeah, what should he have done? It doesn't, it just says the Lord was mad. We don't, how else,
Yeah.
Well, I think there's lessons sometimes about putting ourselves in a place where we shouldn't be, where things go wrong, because he was part of the party that was driving the ark.
Right.
So like, he really shouldn't have been there. They were transporting the ark like they were supposed to. So like, maybe this is a time to stay home and not be involved in something that was already sketchy.
Yeah, no, exactly. The solution to this is to carry the ark in the first place, right? That's the whole reason, is to not even have it on the cart. That's the solution, right, quote unquote, to or how he would not have died, right? So he died because in the very first place they were disobeying it. It is kind of a challenging section, because you're very right. Would it have been better to let it fall and to let the ark hit the ground? I think God would have been probably upset either way, right? That's kind of a no-win scenario, just like Mark was saying, you don't even want to be in that situation in the first place, right? So there's kind of back and forth between that. Do any of you remember the story of Nadab and Abihu? By any chance? Okay, so Nadab and Abihu were sons of Levi, and they were offering sacrifices to God, and it says they offered strange fire. Now that could mean that they put something special in the fire, right, to make it maybe turn colors or to make it smell nice or something like that, or they offered a strange sacrifice that the Lord didn't command them to offer or something like that. Long story short, it's not really that long, but story short, right, the fire springs out and kills Nadab and Abihu for doing this, right? And the question there also is, that seems a bit of a severe response, right? Like, so they die because they tried to mess with the fire. Maybe they were trying to make the fire, like I said, smell better, right? So they made the fire smell better and they died for it, right? The explanation that I heard there is something that I think can apply to this, and I just want to put it forward for thought. So we know God is perfect conceptually, right? But perhaps a way to think about that is that God is so perfect that nothing imperfect can be in his presence, right? It's kind of like, it's like water and oil. When oil tries to touch water, it gets rejected, right? It just gets rejected. It cannot mix, okay? So perhaps what is really going on is God I don't want to say not intentionally, because this is intentional, right? But perhaps what's going on is, when in the case of Nadab and Abihu, they are sinning in the Lord's presence, and as a consequence, they die, because the wages of sin are death, right? They are in the presence of God, and they die because they're trying to pervert what God had told them, right? Similarly, right, what is the ark? What does the ark mean? Anybody know what it is? It says it in, I think, verse 2. Right. The presence of God is supposed to dwell, right? It's, in essence, like a seat, right? The presence of God is supposed to sit in between the two angels, the cherubim, right, that are on top of the ark. And so God says, don't touch it, because you're not clean. No matter how clean you are, you're not clean enough to be in my presence, because you would be destroyed, right? And so God says, don't touch it. And then somebody touches it, and they die as a consequence, not necessarily as a, like, and again, I don't want to take out the intentionality of this, because God did kill him, but perhaps it was a reaction to what had happened, right? Yeah.
Plain stick, don't turn around, do not turn around.
Right. Well, and it just, again, emphasizes the importance, kind of like what you said. God's not messing around. When he tells us these things, he tells us them for a reason, right? He tells us, look, if you sin, the wages of sin are death. You will die if you do this, right? And he's not joking. He's being serious when he says that. In the same way that he says, don't move the ark on a cart, carry it, and don't touch it. That's why I want you to carry it. Don't touch it, right? And then this happens, the exact reason. So, the ark then is left. David's scared, right? Maybe we can give David the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he didn't realize he was doing something wrong, right? So David gets scared and he says, whoa, we need to step back and think about what's going on. So leave that there. Don't even move it anymore. So it stays in the house of this guy named Obed-Edom, who is a Gittite. Let me look for this 1 second. Trying to find through my notes here in 1 minute. Yeah, so Obed-Edom was a Levite. He was from a particular city, which is why he's called the Gittite. So he was of the priestly order, one way or another, right? Even if he wasn't a son of Aaron, he was a Levite, right? So they were the people who were set apart for this reason. So David leaves the ark with him, and the ark of the Lord stays there for 3 months, and Obed-Edom and all his household have abundance, right? They're blessed, which is kind of interesting. It's just interesting in particular because, again, is it the ark that's doing this? Is it the ark, the physical object, that is doing this? No, right? It's God. It's the presence of God being in this person's household, and that's why it's important. So sometimes it gets easy. You can see how the Israelites get mixed up with this, because wherever the ark is, that's a great place to be around, right? The people are blessed where the ark is. But this is why the ark was not in the tabernacle in the first place, because it got moved. The Philistines took it because they put way too much faith in the object and not in the person, or the reason the object was having any pleasant effects, right? All right, so let's read. Let's read 12 through 16. Can anybody do that for me? Okay.
Now it was told King David, saying, the Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with gladness. And so it was, when those bearing the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, that he sacrificed oxen and fatted sheep. Then David danced before the Lord with all his might, and David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the trumpet. Now as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, Saul's daughter, looked through a window and saw King David weeping and groaning before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart.
Yeah. Okay. So this time, right, they do it right, if you notice that. And then those who were carrying the ark of the Lord, right? So they come back and they say, oh, okay, we're not doing it wrong this time. They make sure they get the right people. I think it's 2 Chronicles. No, 1 Chronicles. In 1 Chronicles, there's a parallel account of this, right? And it details exactly who David brought. And David brought a lot of priests. So he brought a lot of Levites with him, and he brought the particular people necessary, and they carry it out of the house of Obed-Edom. And when they take 6 steps, he sacrifices to God as like a double cover. He's like, look, I'm sorry. We're going to do it right this time. And he sacrifices while they're carrying it.
I want to back up just a moment.
Go ahead.
I'm just thinking through something.
Yeah.
Is maybe not be then that the fact that he touched the ark as much as it was the reason why he touched the ark. I've seen men do some very good things for the wrong reason.
Yeah.
Where was, why did he touch the ark? I think God probably looked at the reason he touched the ark. Was it to make a name for himself or something of that nature? I think it was more than the fact that he touched the ark. I think God looked at the heart of that man and wanted to try to understand why he did what he did. Did he do it for the right reason, or did he do it for a different reason?
Right. And that could be, right, if we're looking at verse 6, right, my translation, I think, is a little bit more explicit than the one that we read. It says, when they came to Nachon's threshing floor, Uzzah reached out to the ark of God and took hold of it because the oxen stumbled and nearly overturned it, right? So it was like imminently falling. So you could be right? There could be reasons that we don't know about for why he touched it. But the only thing that we have to go off of directly was that the ark was falling in the process of falling, and he touched it to stop it and turned it right and then died. Yeah, something like that. Could be. It could have been, one of those very weird scenarios where it like bounced just right and flipped over on its base or something like that. Who knows? We don't really know. But I think the important thing to learn from this, right, that we can apply is that what God says God means, and then on top of that, it's not just to sin means later death. Like there is imminent danger in sin, right? You internally are in imminent danger, and perhaps in some cases externally in imminent danger when you sin, right? Which is thank God for the blood of Jesus, right? Okay, so he sacrifices as they're carrying it back out of the house of Obed-Edom. You got to be sad if you're Obed-Edom, huh? And they carry it by the poles. They go 6. Yeah, there we go. And David is dancing before the Lord with great enthusiasm, and he's wearing a linen ephod. Does anybody know what that is? It looks kind of like an apron. Yes, it does look kind of like an apron. Yeah. It's what the priests would wear, yeah. So something that I was reading when I was studying for this described it. Yes, it kind of looks like an apron a little bit, but it is in particular a priestly garment. And the way that I had read when I was studying for this is that it said, this kind of is like wearing a graduation gown. Like nobody does this except for people who are graduating. Nobody does this except for people who are priests. This was only worn by the priests, only in particular times, only when they're performing priestly duties, right? It's a very ceremonial robe. So he's wearing one of these things. So I want you to pay attention to that, because as we're going to go down through here, we're going to have a lot of interesting parallels between David and the priesthood, and I want to know what you guys think about that. So let's read 17 through 22, if we could, or 21. Anybody else? I know it's a little early and we're all tired, but thank you.
They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. After he had finished sacrificing burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. Then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israelites, both men and women. And all the people went to their homes. When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, disrobing in the sight of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar felon would." David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from this house when he appointed me over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor."
Okay. So I'm reading through this, right? I want to mention one thing in particular. Show of hands, who was told David is naked while he's dancing before the Lord when they're kids? Or even younger or earlier than this? Has anybody been told the story of David dancing naked in front of God? Okay, this is what I've always been told, and I wanted to address this in case anybody had not been. There's actually, like, when looking up images of this verse or whatever else, right, you'll actually see David dancing in his small clothes a lot of times. They'll dance in, like, underwear, right? And so I wanted to address this in case anybody had ever heard this, because reading through this was like, that's not really what I'm seeing. What is it told that David's wearing? Priestly gown, the linen ephod, right? The reason I think that people get that David was naked, or at least had disrobed at some point, is because of what Michael says. So Michael says to him, you have uncovered yourself and stripped in the eyes of his servants' maids, is like what that says. And I want to just clarify real fast. That word can and often does refer to becoming naked, right? It's like you uncover yourself and then his nakedness, right? Is a lot of the translation. Like if you look at other translations, it'll say you uncovered yourself and your nakedness or something like that. They're very often connected, but not always. This also can just mean to reveal, right? Like for example, in 1 Samuel earlier on and in Genesis, they actually use the same kind of context. God uncovers himself to priests or to prophets, right? And the idea is not that he's disrobing, but rather that he's making known. He's lowering himself to talk to, right? He's sometimes it says continues to say to the prophet, right? And the word of the Lord was with, right? That's sometimes the translation. So it's the idea is not necessarily that David was naked, but I want to posit to you that perhaps what it's talking about is really just David was humbling himself and not acting like a king.
When royalty goes in public, even today, they dress in royal garments, whether it be robes or gowns or whatever.
Yep.
And what he did was he took off his royalty clothing
Right,
and was dressed like others, whether it be the priests or the people.
right.
And that, in its sense, is saying, I am one of you.
Right, exactly. And, well, yes, we'll come back to that. But yes, you're absolutely right. But not only is he wearing clothes like poor people, right, in essence, who remembers, what do the Levites have by law? Right? God portions out Israel, okay? He portions out the land. I know it was probably 6 months ago that we were studying this. God portions out the land. What does he give to the Levites? Nothing, like next to nothing, right? Why? They're the priests. That's their job, right? They don't have a lot of land. They don't have a lot of possessions. They are the priesthood. They oftentimes, a lot of the priests survived on the sacrifices because the people would come in and sacrifice, and some of the sacrifices supposed to be set aside for the priests. That's what they ate, right? So a lot of times, that's what we're looking at. The priests don't have anything. David's dressing like the priests, right? Even though he's the king. He doesn't have anything. It's in essence what that's saying. You're exactly right. He's lowering himself to be so humble as to say, I'm a servant of God, right? And that's my job. What? Humbling, exactly, right? And that makes David's response make a little bit more sense to me. I was reading this last night, and I don't know where I had been told this, but I feel like I've been told this, and I talked to my girlfriend, and she thought the same thing. She's like, that's always what I've been told too. But it makes a lot more sense in verse 22 that he didn't make him, like, he's not talking about being naked. And the reason is, if you pay attention, yet I will demean myself even more than this, and will be humbled in my own sight, but by the maids whom you mentioned, by them I shall be held in honor. That's a little weird if what he's talking about is being naked, right? I don't think that's what he's talking about.
I think he's really, what he's doing is because she sounds to me like she's kind of snobby.
Yes,
You know, she's kind of like, well, you're supposed to be the king. Why are you acting like a fool?
right,
You know, and he's saying, I'm humbling myself before God and humbling myself before the servants
right,
to show them I am his equal.
right,
To them as anybody else. 'Cause
right.
he has to humble himself before God.
And it's, somebody asked me at one point, like, why do you think it's the maids? But it's not just the maids, right? Who is it? It is let me quote it real fast. In the eyes of his servants' maids, right? So it's like the servants of the servants. In essence, she's saying, even the lowest people, right? They all saw you like this. And he's saying, by the lowest of the low, they're going to be who holds me in honor because I did this for God, right? In the same way that all of them should do it for God. Just like you mentioned before, we're all the same, right? He's saying that in the eyes of God, we're all the same, which is really interesting. Okay, did anybody else pay any attention to any of did anybody find anything that David did that might have flagged you as a little presumptuous priestly-wise? Anybody see anything in particular? I know it's a long discussion in between now and then, but... Well, yes, so he was wearing the clothes. Well, but he was humbling himself by wearing priestly garments, right? So they're wearing the same garments, okay? Anything else in particular? If we want to look through, find a little bit. In 18, David finished offering burnt offerings, right? And he blessed the people. Thank you. That was an obscure one. I'm glad you got that one. Yeah. So David finishes offering burnt offerings and peace offerings, and he blesses the people in the name of the Lord, right? So oftentimes the blessing of the people was done by the priests. I didn't know that before last night, so I was glad you caught that. That's good. Yeah. So is there any conflict with this, right? What do we think? Is David doing something wrong again? Right. Well, yeah, so that could be a very valid reading of this is, well, God didn't do anything to him, right? We just had a passage where somebody violated the commandments of the Lord, and as a consequence, somebody died, right? David does all this, nobody dies. It's still happy, everybody's fine. So David is probably doing something that is at least okay, question mark, right? Oh boy. That's okay. All right, so what David does, so he also feeds the people. That's the other thing. He hands them out a loaf of bread, cake of dates, and a cake of raisins. So what David's doing is David is performing sacrifices that he's supposed to and allowed to perform, okay? It doesn't necessarily mean that priests didn't perform it. There are some people who say, well, what he was really doing is David was having the priests do it right next to him. Okay, he's like, David then asked the priest next to him to do it. But from what we can read of the word, that's not exactly what's happening. It appears that David is doing it himself, okay? A lot of what David's doing in the sense isn't necessarily prescribed only to the priests. If this were in the tabernacle, or in the future in the temple, the priests would have to do this. It would be required for them to sacrifice on the altar of the tabernacle. But it wasn't necessary outside the altar of the tabernacle. Technically, it wasn't specifically the priests who were supposed or who needed to do this, right? In fact, one of the sacrifices, the peace offering, right? Part of the peace offering was sacrificing something and then taking some of that sacrifice and eating it yourself. So the idea was you sacrifice part to God, you eat some of it. It's kind of like a communal meal between you and God, and you're like, I'm sorry. So that's in essence what the peace offering was. So David is kind of skirting the line of priesthood, but he's not actually doing anything that is required to be done by the priests. If we turn to 1 Chronicles, I believe it's chapter 17. Yes, 1 Chronicles chapter 17, real fast. So this is a parallel account. It's basically the exact same thing. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. It's chapter 16. We can see that David is actually very careful about this. So we don't really have much of the account beyond, oh, it happened in 2 Samuel. But in 1 Chronicles, I'm sorry, did I say Corinthians? No, okay. I did? I'm so sorry. I did say Chronicles. Okay, good deal. I get them mixed up sometimes, and that's my bad. They're very, very different, promise. So I know. All right, 1 Chronicles chapter 16. So they brought the ark of God, and they set it inside the tent which David had pitched for it, and they offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before God. When David had finished offering the burnt offerings, so David's doing it, and the peace offerings. He blessed the people in the name of the Lord. He distributed to everyone in Israel, both men and women, to everyone a loaf of bread, a portion of meat, and a raisin cake. He appointed some of the Levites to minister before the ark of the Lord, and to profess God's name, and to thank and praise the Lord, the God of Israel. And then it names like a bunch of who was doing stuff. He had trumpets blowing continually and musical instruments, and they were singing, and he composed a psalm and like all sorts of crazy things that they were doing. And then in verse 37, so David left Asaph and his relatives before the ark of the covenant of the Lord to minister before the ark continually as each day's work required. So David was careful about this. He left what was necessary to be done by the Levites to the Levites. He gave them those jobs. And he actually called up, like I said, a bunch of them to do it, right? He had everybody sitting there in front of the ark. They were doing what was necessary per day. So I don't know about you guys. I know that's a bit of a tangent. It's important to me because there's some scenarios. There's one in particular in the New Testament. The passage escapes me at the moment. It's when Jesus' disciples are picking the heads of grain on the Sabbath. And Jesus says, yeah, but even David did this on the Sabbath, right? He even took, well, not the Sabbath, but he took some of the priestly stuff out of the temple and ate it, right? And that always gave me kind of a weird feeling. I don't know about you guys, but that gave me a weird feeling because does that mean what David did was right by taking what was set aside for the priests? There's some wiggle room, right? And I just want to point that out here when we're reading this. David does some of these things, but he's also very careful to keep a lot of the commandments of God. He went back to his credit to Obed-Edom and did it right the second time, right? But he also was very careful to leave to the priests what was needed to the priests, but do everything else himself, right? And then we have the very last verse, Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. Whether that's a consequence of this exact verse or not is kind of left up to us. Suffice to say, I think we can get an idea of who Michal is from these from this verse, right? She was looking for status and prestige, and David was not giving it to her, so she was upset, and probably in consequence of that attitude, she had no children, right? But thank you guys all for listening. I appreciate you guys. Go ahead, sure.
The application that I see that the church, I wrote this down, is people are hungry for ways to gather together, to come together, to serve, to pray together. If you notice, like the ark, people gathered and singing, pray, and those type of things. They became a community that became one and united. As Mark has talked about membership in the church and how important that is, it's kind of what I see here is, here's an opportunity for people really to unite as one and be focused on one thing, and that's God. I think that's kind of what I see here as these people are gathering, and there's just a fellowship and a celebration, and I think that's kind of what the church should be also.
Yeah, and I want you to hold on to that thought because next week that becomes very important, right? So that was good. Appreciate it. Thank you guys for all listening. I appreciate it.